everybody, and welcome back to my English literature playlist or my English literature course. So in this lesson we're going to talk about the Anglo-Saxon literature. You've asked me for this topic, for this lesson, and I also made an introduction in my previous video, okay, that was about the development of the English language. In fact, in this lesson we're going to talk a lot about the Old English. And if you want to know more details about this Old English and the features of this Old English, you can go back to my previous video about the development of the English literature, and you can have details and so on. Now, talking about the literature of this time. This time we are talking specifically about the 7th century, okay? And so we're talking about a period that was before the Norman Conquest. This is very important because we know that the Norman Conquest changed, okay, a lot, not only the language but also society, okay, and the history of this area. And the Norman Conquest was in 1066, okay, so that was the period, and from that moment on a lot of things changed, okay, the language that was influenced by French, but also society and obviously literature. Now we are talking about the 7th century, more or less, and we can say that literature in this time was actually characterized by poetry. And poetry was actually divided into two groups, okay, pagan poetry on one side and Christian poetry on the other side. So pagan poetry was actually, we can say, a national product, okay. It was, it was created from by the German tradition, and it witnesses, okay, how these populations lived, how the society was actually structured. So it tells us a lot about that world, about those populations. Basically it is characterized by sagas and legends, tales. It was normally oral literature, okay, and then most of the times those stories were written by monks in monasteries, and for these reasons they were also manipulated, and we can find some Christian elements that actually didn't exist in the first place. So this is pagan poetry. On the other side there is Christian poetry. Christian poetry is obviously based on the Bible, okay, so stories are taken from the Bible and they talk about the lives of the saints, okay, most of the times. And after the Norman Conquest, as I said before, in 1066, the pagan poetry was cancelled, okay, there was no pagan poetry anymore, which basically was what was even good, okay, on one side, because actually it preserved the unique character of this poetry, okay, of this witness, we can say. So talking about pagan poetry, as I said before, it was oral at first, then it was written down in monasteries by monks, and they interpolated Christian elements, and so they added Christian elements, Christian interpretations, Christian symbols. So now, today, when we study those works, we have just to pay attention and to imagine which elements couldn't exist in the first place, and we have to try and catch the real intention of the work. Now, pagan poetry can be also divided into two groups. On one side we have pagan lyric, and on the other side pagan epic. Okay, pagan lyric is basically, but it consists, okay, of elegies. They are very important because they are actually a record of the time. The most important ones are to be found in the Exeter book, and they are I read them so I don't forget any of them. The banished wife's complaint, the earl's lament, the wanderer, the seafarer, the ruin, and the husband message. Now, the main characteristics, the common features of these works, basically the atmosphere in all these elegies the atmosphere is very, very melancholic, and they all represent and describe a sort of a fate that has to be accepted with a very stoic resignation, with a very stoic attitude. All of them, except in the ruin, are told in the first person singular, and they have some common themes, some common elements, common topics. And for example, the departure of the loved one, or sort of a nostalgic feeling, and also exile or banishment. As I said before, they are a record of the time, of society, of the tradition of the time, and especially of the stratification of society. So the social ladder, we can say so, the hierarchical order with the lord on the top rung, okay, of this ladder. Now, so the first group, pagan lyric, second group, as I said before, pagan epic. The most famous work is the Beowulf, okay, everyone knows about this work. The Beowulf was an Old English poem, probably from the 8th century, and it is based on a Scandinavian saga, on a Scandinavian legend. It is basically the plot is divided into two stories, okay, which have just one element in common, which is the protagonist, so the Beowulf, basically. In the first story, Beowulf helps the king of the Danes. This is also very important because this is also a witness of the kingdom of the times. He helps the king of the Danes against a monster. Okay, there is this monster that attacks the palace on a regular basis, and Beowulf fights against Grendel, so this monster, and he kills him. But the mother of the monster wants a revenge. She tries to avenge the son, basically, and so Beowulf has to fight against the mother as well, and finally he wins. Then the second story is quite similar, but in this case Beowulf is old. He is an old king that has to fight against another monster, a dragon in this case, and he fights and he wins, he kills the dragon, but he dies, okay, in the end. So the second story ends basically with the death of the protagonist. Now, what is very interesting here is, first of all, the language. The language is the Wessex Dialect. When I talked in my previous video about the development of the English language and about the Old English, I said that there were 4 main dialects at the time. One was the Mercian dialect, and Mercia was a land quite in the middle of the Isle. Then the Kentish dialect, okay, Kent is well known today as well. Then the Northumbrian dialect. Northumbria was a land quite in the north, of the island. And finally the Wessex dialect. The Wessex dialect is particularly interesting because especially later, okay, during the phase, okay, of the Middle English, this will be the root of the Standard English. So this is also very important. One of the characteristics of the Wessex dialect is that there were inflections, okay. In fact, in the Old English we have this very common feature, okay, of inflections, as it was in Latin, for example. in English, in modern English, we don't have inflections anymore, but in other Germanic language we do, like in German, for example. In the Old English, there were the same cases we have in German today, for example. So, nominative for the subject, then accusative for the object, and dative and genitive. We don't have vocative and ablative as in Latin, okay? We have only 4 cases. Obviously, inflections were used, were basically the change of the suffix of the noun and other parts of the sentence, okay, depending on the role that that specific word had within the sentence. So it was basically the syntax of the Old English. So we have inflections and we don't have rhymes. Absolutely. We have very long lines divided in the middle by a long pause, and a very common element, very typical of the time, cannings. Cannings were metaphorical circumlocutions that were used in order to identify and to describe characters, basically, cannings. Then another common element in that characterize Beowulf, but also the lyrics. Okay, so the pagan lyric we talked about before was nature. Nature, in this case, in the Beowulf in particular, was typical of the cold Scandinavia, and the atmosphere, as we said before, for the elegies, it was quite gloomy and creepy as well. The North Sea is rough and stormy most of the times. The land is characterized by forests or caves or pools, black pools, dark pools in general, and the land is always windy and, as I said before, quite gloomy. Seasons are also a metaphor, okay, and they're also used in order to create that very melancholic atmosphere. Winter was characterized by aurora borealis, but it gave a sort of a very strange, unnatural, and almost creepy atmosphere. As I said before, melancholy, solitude, and doom are probably the most important elements and intentions, okay, because these atmospheres kind of created and suggested this kind of feelings. As for the historical and social accuracy, as I said before, these works are very important. They are real record, okay, of the time, especially aristocratic life in this case. Aristocratic life, life in general actually, was based on very simple and natural laws. Eating, drinking, hunting, fighting, sleeping, okay, they were the most important elements. So life was actually quite simple and based on natural laws. Then there were also some palaces and banquets, okay, and so sort of a social life, and that was also, they could also give us some elements, okay, to probably to understand better the social life of the time. I'm always talking about the aristocratic life, obviously. There are mythical elements. It's quite obvious. We have monsters, we have dragons. That was also typical of the Nibelungenlied. This is another epic word, okay, it's another, we can say, pagan epic belonging to the Germanic culture, so old German language basically. But there are many elements in common with this heroic themes and heroic gestures and goodness against evil, and evil is always represented by these monsters and mythical figures. We can say that actually dragons, monsters, they do have metaphorical, symbolic meaning, because they represent basically the hardships of life, the difficulties of life and everything. But on the other side, we can also say that we can say they belong to an imagery that represents distorted elements, distorted objects because of the climate, okay, fog and wind and storms and we can say this strange light. They created actually distorted elements. So yes, of course they had a metaphorical meaning, but on the other side they are also the representation of quite typical imagery of the time, basically. Now, there is a last point, okay, which is about Christian elements. Well, we are talking about pagan epic, so it could seem actually quite strange and probably a nonsense to talk about Christian elements. But as I said before, we have to read all these works through the eyes and through the pen of the monks in monasteries. So they really added a lot of Christian interpretation that didn't exist in the first place, like for example moral virtues, in this case generosity, fighting against cowardice or cruelty. Now, these interpolations were actually very common and created a manipulation of pagan works. In this case, for example, Beowulf is seen like a Christ, okay? And he fights for to save the kingdom, and the kingdom is the mankind, okay? He struggles in the lake, and the depth of the lake is hell, and he fights against the monster, and the monster is obviously the devil. He uses a very special sword. Especially in the second story, he uses this sort of a magical sword to kill the dragon, and the sword becomes, okay, in this sort of a Christian interpretation, becomes a cross, okay, because of the shape of the sword, okay, basically. The swords have a play a very important role actually in epic, in British epic, and we will see that also later while talking about the Arthurian legends, okay. So Excalibur, the sword, with this important role, this important meaning, and this important legend behind. So swords had really a very metaphorical and symbolical meaning. Obviously, the cross had nothing to do with that, but anyway, that's the way it is represented by monks. Well, we have just talked about pagan poetry, okay, so pagan lyrics, so elegies, and pagan epic. Now, just a very short moment to talk about Christian poetry. Now, Christian poetry is quite important because talking about the Christian poetry, we find the first recorded names of poets, so authors. Because talking about sagas, legends, tales, lyrics, and so on, they were all orally that were oral stories that didn't have a proper author, okay. Now in this case we have the first name of a couple of poets that should actually have existed. Now obviously there are many doubts nowadays, and there are studies to determine if they actually existed or not, but anyway, they should. Two of them, probably the most famous one, are, well, one of them is Sadman. Okay, Sadman. He was a lay brother in a monastery, and he was minding the cattle when he received this incredible inspiration, and he started writing poetry. And his poems are collected in the Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum. Then the second poet that probably existed was Beowulf. Beowulf, well, he signed his works in runic characters, and that made his existence probably more believable. He wrote many different famous works, like, for example, Juliana, or the Fates of the Apostles, or Elena, so some works that are still studied and known nowadays. Well, I think it's all for today. I hope I have given you quite detailed idea, okay, even if it was a quite general idea at the same time, of what the Anglo-Saxon literature was about. I hope you liked my video, and as always, if you find that interesting, please leave me a like. It's very, very important for me to see your feedback, and thank you for your amazing comments. They really mean the world to me. And if you hadn't subscribed the channel, please do, and click on the bell, okay, to receive news and to see, eventually to watch more videos about English literature. This is my playlist here, but I've got obviously many other playlists concerning well, English language and American literature and so on. So I hope you find my videos interesting. I thank you so very much for your support and for watching me today. Thank you so much, and see you again very soon with English literature. Bye!